Okay. So in some of the Makot, there is an emphasis on the fact that the Makot only affected the Egyptians and not the Jews. So, for example, here we go. Let's start today. Let's get a good one here. So, for example, in Dever, Moshe says, "V'yifla Adonai ben miknei Yisrael ben miknei Mitzrayim v'lo yamut mikol livnei Yisrael davar." Right? Of the animals of the Egyptians, so their animals will die, and not a single animal will die from the Jews. And then that's Moshe's prediction in Pasuk Dalet, and then Pasuk Zayin, you hear Vayishlach Paro. Right? Paro is curious, right? Consistently throughout the Makot, you see this phenomenon, which we've talked about in the past, maybe we'll talk about again, that Paro seems not just to be interested in power, right? Not just, wow, there was a miracle, but in precision. Because part of the educational lesson here isn't just that there is a powerful God, but that this God is actually in control. It's one thing to say, look, someone's powerful, he can drop a bomb. It's another thing to say he's in control, and therefore can be very precise in terms of who he hits. And Paro is consistently swayed by precision as much as he is by power. So in Pasuk Zayin, you find out, Vayishlach Paro v'hinei lo meit mimiknei Yisrael ad echad. He finds out that this is indeed the case, so at that point he should have changed his mind, and that's why the Pasuk has to tell you, V'echbad leiv Paro v'lo shilach hara'am, that he had to harden his heart and not send them. But fundamentally he was impressed by the precision. Here's the question, though. In order to understand whether this, first of all, we know this happens by Dever. Does it happen by the other plagues? We don't know. We don't actually know whether this is the case. But figuring out to the extent to which that would be miraculous forces us to understand what exactly is the physical proximity of the Jews to Egyptians in Mitzrayim, because right, that would affect it. Right? If, let's say, Barad, so Barad, it would be very miraculous if it didn't hit the Jews, if the Jews were living next door to the Egyptians. Less not miraculous, but less miraculous if the Jews are cloistered in Goshen, because, it happens. Sometimes it rains everywhere, right? Like last year we had, Shua remembers this, we had 4 meters of rain, right? The country was completely overwhelmed by rain, but the south got less rain than it normally does, right? Because it was, right, it was in the north, it was in the center, it was in the Yerushalayim area, and for some reason the south, it just didn't get it, and Israel's not a big country. These things can happen, so it's not as miraculous. You think about Dever, if the Jews are living amongst the Egyptians, then this is really miraculous. If they're not, so it's miraculous, I guess, that the Dever didn't spread to Goshen, but sometimes that happens, right? There's no mingling of the animals, so it's self-contained. So in order to understand it, you got to figure out, where are the Jews living? And here the Mefarshim really divide. Certain Mefarshim think that the Jews are living everywhere. What evidence would you have that would indicate that the Jews are living everywhere? Throw out some evidence to understand where the Mefarshim come from.
You could argue that because...
Evidence, yeah.
Okay, then never mind.
Evidence.
Or have actual evidence.
Here, Perek Aleph Pasuk Zayin of Shemot. This is Ibn Ezra's evidence. Uvnei Yisrael paru, vayishretzu, vayirbu, vayatzmu b'ma'od me'od. Next 3 words. Batim malei ha'aretz. Otam. The land is filled. So the Ibn Ezra says, Vatim malei ha'aretz. 1 second. Ibn Ezra is 2 perushim. I'm sorry, in one shot he says, right, so, Vatim al-Aretz Otam would mean, right, could mean the whole country. Now, if you wanted to limit it, so in one place Ibn Ezra says, it is, Vatim al-Aretz is Eretz Goshen, right? So the Ibn Ezra is a stira. In the Perush HaKatzar he writes, Kol Eretz Malchut Mitzrayim. And the Perush Aruch he writes, Eretz Goshen. So right here, you see the 2 possibilities here, right? If you want to take it literally, like the Ibn Ezra himself did in the Perush HaKatzar, then this is evidence they filled the whole country. If you want to be committed to the notion that the Jews are living only in Goshen, then you have to reinterpret that pasuk like he does in his Perush Aruch, and say it means that they only filled Goshen. Right? So give me more evidence. What other evidence might you have towards whether they're only living in Goshen or are they spread out in the whole world, the whole land?
I mean, are we allowed to pull from later?
Yeah, but just evidence, right?
So then they had neighbors to go to.
Good, exactly. That's the other big piece of evidence the Mefarshim say, which is Moshe, when he tells them to borrow things, and never give them back, right? He says that they should borrow it from their neighbors, which sounds like their neighbors are Egyptians, right? Well, I mean, obviously that's what's going on. Obviously the point is that they're Egyptians. So therefore, Mefarshim who want to argue that they have spread out point to the fact that they clearly have Egyptian neighbors. Now, the Mefarshim divide. Some of the Mefarshim say, look, again, now I'm looking at Alatar's summary of it, but you can look at their million Mefarshim as usual. It really is the best website for learning Chumash. It really is. So the Mefarshim will say, look, clearly they started in Goshen. But that's the whole point, according to this. If you think they spread out, that's the whole point of Aleph, Zion, and Shemot. Is that they eventually spread out. Now, they divide. Some of the Mefarshim say they started in Goshen practically because they were shepherds, and as they grew, they stopped being shepherds, and that's why they moved out of Goshen. Other people say, no, they moved to Goshen to prevent assimilation. Eventually, they didn't care about assimilation, which comes to a different question, which is how good are the Jews in Egypt, which is a very complicated story, which we'll have to do at another point. The Maseh Hashem says maybe they didn't spread out to all the cities, but maybe they at least spread out into the fields. Now, why would they have moved out of Goshen, according to the people who think they did? So either simply they had so many people, which is, the simple pshat. The Ramban is an interesting pshat, and the Ramban says, look, it's not that they wanted to move out of Goshen. You know why they moved out of Goshen? Because
they were forced to work on projects?
Not projects, actually the opposite. Right? That the Ramban says that the Jews were divided. Some of them worked on national projects, and those Jews lived in Goshen. But some of them were taken as private slaves, right, in households. So those Jews lived in the Egyptians' houses, right? So we can talk about them being in different places, either that they actually moved there, or that they were taken as slaves, and therefore they were butlers, and they were maids, and they were whatever. And Memela, right? They were in the whole country. On the other hand, you could say that, and this goes in line with the claims that the Jews were assimilated, that at some point they wanted to assimilate, right? So that's sort of possibility one, and again, part of the raya that it happened, the fact that they have Egyptian neighbors to borrow from, and one more big proof that the people in this camp take is, this is really next week's parsha, but that's fine, is that God had to jump over their doorways. If they're in Goshen, what do you mean you jumped over the doorways? Just don't visit Goshen, right? Visit the rest of the country and don't visit Goshen, right? So that's possibility one, that they are integrated, and that's why they're borrowing from the neighbors. That's why it's a miracle that things aren't happening, or maybe it does happen to them, right? Maybe some of the Makot happened to them, and that's why Dever is such a big miracle, because that didn't happen to them, but maybe other ones did. Now, some Mefarshim say, this goes back already to Philo, that even if they lived amongst each other, the Makot still didn't hit the Jews. None of them. Right? That what's true of Dever is true of all of the Makot. Other Mefarshim saying, no, maybe that's not true. Maybe really the other plagues did hit Jews. They just didn't hit Goshen. Right? And the miracle of Dever, that Dever wasn't like that. Right? But other Makot, maybe they really did get hit. Right? If they were where in an Egyptian's house and there were frogs around, so lo naim. What do you want from my life?
Why is
right?
there such a thing with Dever? That's specifically Dever, we know for a fact.
I don't know why.
Also, no,
it's just that right. That seems to be. Well, the pasuk says right that not a. Yeah, it is a pasuk.
Okay,
it's a pasuk. Why Dever is a good question. Maybe tomorrow I'll try to think of it. I haven't really thought about why it would be Dever, but okay. Now,
season spreads.
No, I understand.
So intuitively, you would think it would have to spread.
No, I understand why this is the biggest miracle, right? Why, though, that one, maybe it's because of this notion that we want to teach Paro that God is precise, right? Even when it doesn't, maybe that's what it is, right? It's the most counterintuitive, right? That could be, right? I'm willing to buy that. Okay, but that's possibility one. Possibility two is they only live in Goshen. So Reb David Tzvi Hoffman really thinks that, look, they were in Goshen and there was no one else. There were no Egyptians there, and then you have to read Vatim al Eretz Otam, like that other day in the Ibn Ezra, that it's only Goshen, and then you have to say why that they don't get hit by the plagues at all because they're just in a different place. That's part of the notion. How would you deal with their neighbors? Right, they're borrowing from their neighbors. You'll have to take it more metaphorically. The people in Egypt or something like that. The Rashbam and Rosa Bechor Shor say that there is support for the notion that no Egyptians lived there, which was the fact that Yocheved was able to hide Moshe for a while. If the Egyptians were really integrated, so that would be hard to hide Moshe. That maybe that's part of why they could do it. And then how are you going to understand Makat Bechorot? It probably won't mean he jumped over the individual ones. It means like I protected you more generally. The third possibility.
Also in Makat Bechorot, though, there were plenty of Jews who did not do the Korban Pesach and therefore were also...
well, we don't know how many Jews actually didn't, or if any didn't. We just know that theoretically, if they hadn't, they would be punished. We don't have any evidence.
But you could read it there as...
Right, but it sounds like Egyptians versus Jews. I mean, the Pasuk says Egyptians versus Jews.
Rabbi,
yeah.
You could consider the possibility of Goshen not being exclusively
Good, so that's the third possibility. Good, so that's the third possibility. Is the Mefarshim would say, look, yes, the Jews only lived in Goshen, but you mixed it up. It's that the Jews only lived in Goshen, but it wasn't only Jews in Goshen. Right, you have three possibilities. The Jews spread the country out of the country. The Jews were in a ghetto, or the Jews only could live in Goshen, but other people could live there. And here again, the Mefarshim divide. Like, why is this? So, some Mefarshim say that the Egyptians were always there. Right, that this was like, you know how like sometimes we have in America all the time, you have Jewish communities where like there were always non-Jews living there, and eventually we sort of take over, and there's the only people you sort of realize are there because we live in our cloistered bubble, but there were always non-Jews living there, and they still do, right? So some Mefarshim, like Rav David Tzvi says, that's what Goshen was, right? It was a completely normal city. The Jews just kept moving into it, and it became overwhelming. There were 38 million shuls, but like Mimela, there were also... What? Exactly, but there were non-Jews there, shockingly, right? You just didn't notice, right? The Lekach Tov, though, has a much more sinister shot, which is, no, this really was originally a ghetto. When did non-Jews move in? When Paro tried to kill all the babies, he needed to integrate Egyptians there to make sure that they weren't hiding babies, right? So that originally, yes, it was a ghetto. It was only around the time of Paro's decrees that he started planting Egyptians to live in Goshen to be his spies.
But not,
right?
You could also just say not only that, but also as a population trap, he's trying to demographically integrate them because they were...
Sure, you could say that too. Again, you could say many things. The Lekach though happens to take this particular sinister approach, right? Now this comes down to a different question, which is what does Vayiven Lahem Batim, Rabbi Yasu Lahem Batim mean, right? We're used to Rashi's Pshat, that the Mialdot, God made them houses, but some of them versions say no, because the plan wasn't working that the Mialdot were killing the babies, Vayas Lahem Batim, Paro made houses for the Egyptians amongst the Jews, so they would find the babies, right? So that's part of that much more sinister pshat. But like I said, there's two questions again that we dealt with here. One is the general question where they live, right? Only Goshen and only Jews all over the land, or in Goshen, but there were non-Jews who either always were living there or moved there, right? Issues that this has to explain are Batim Alei Zotam. How do they have neighbors? Why is God skipping over them in Mitzrayim? The middle possibility, which is they only live in Goshen, but non-Jews live there, and their Rambans, I guess, is also sort of a middle shot, right? Which is Jews live in Goshen if they are working for the state, but the Jews who are enslaved in people's houses, Memela, they live in other places. One second. And as I said, the question that this influences is the extent to which the Makot affected the Jews. By Dever, we know it didn't, right? Why is that such a miracle? They only lived in Goshen, it's a minor miracle. They lived everywhere, it's a super big miracle. What about the other Makot? So again, here the Mefarshim divide. One second. Some of them say that in a Hanami, all the Makot are like this. The Jews aren't affected, or at least other Mepharshim say, no, Goshen isn't affected, but the Jews that are found elsewhere in the country, Memela, right? They are a butler in somebody's house, and there are frogs jumping everywhere. Like, what are you going to do? I don't know, maybe they didn't jump with their heads, but like, it's not lo na'im. B'chol mikra, and therefore the question of geography influences the question of how much you think the Jews rather, felt the plagues that are going on in Mitzrayim, and therefore these questions are related, and at least you have to think about them. And again, remember, we do these parsha for like 10, 15 minutes. Today, 15, which is more than I want to, right? There are a lot more details. I'm just giving you Rashi Prakim to think about it. And Dafka in these parsha, where we know the story so well, making you rethink things is half the battle. The rest you can go look it up. There are more details here, right? Vidach Zilg. More, like I said, in this one, Allah Torah, whenever they have something, it's great. You can just go, they have the summary, and then they have their 30 pages of Makaros. You can read inside. Pace had his hand up first, then Asher, and then we'll finish, yeah. What?
Speak.
Also, Egypt isn't that small. Because you can't go from Goshen to some guy who lives in Upper Egypt's house in one day.
Right, that's the Ramban's argument. That's what the Ramban says, that the Jews who worked for the crown might have lived in Goshen, but the Jews who worked as butlers were in the rest of the country. That's exactly his argument. That's why he said that when we talk about neighbors and we talk about the miracle the Jews aren't affected, we're not talking about the Jews in Goshen. The Jews in Goshen, fine, they're far away. But the butlers and maids, right, it's a big miracle. They're in the Egyptians' houses in Echanami, right? Egypt is huge, right? So they can't live in Goshen and be, the wet nurse for somebody, like you have to be up in the middle of the night and wherever. Yeah.
Okay. So to that point of the Rambam, what? I can't just go to Machane Ofer and grab some random prisoner and say, hey, you're my butler now. You can't milk a cow you don't own. You can't just great, there's slaves in the country. I'm just going to go take one as my own maid.
Read any American history? That is exactly what they did. You, slave, you're my butler. You have a family? Too bad. That's slavery, man.
It's not a prisoner.
That's slavery. That was oversimplification. My point is, yes, you can.
It's not that the government had slaves and someone was like, hey, you're mine now. Fine. And walked away.
Fine. The government has slaves and they buy.
The government could sell the slaves. The government could delegate and say, oh, this is an important person, right? Here, he's the diplomat. Go, be a security guard at the diplomat's house, right? Government can do whatever they want. I don't know how that worked, okay? Figure it out. I don't know. I'm making it up. I'm being anachronistic, okay?